All right, guys, so Francis Ngannou, he signs to the PFL, and I go to the comments and I start seeing what you guys are saying in there because I'm interested. I'm interested to hear our community's take on how they feel about Francis going over to the PFL and what they think this could mean for the future of MMA. And I am shocked at how many MMA fans hate the UFC and want it to fail. I think there's a bigger issue going on right now that this Francis Ngannou situation has made bubble up. And I think there's a few things that I really want to get off my chest and just talk about, because the fans of MMA are going to ruin MMA if we keep thinking like this. The comments have been, good on you, Francis. Get over there, got yourself a bag. Well done. What a big L for the UFC. And I don't see that at all. If anything, I think the deal that Francis got is a worse deal than he would have got long term if he had stayed with the UFC. He would have been more financially stable to stay on with the UFC, in my opinion. But the whole did Francis make a good decision or not is a video for another time. Let's break this down just a little bit, guys. Why are the fighters cage fighting primarily? I would say it's to make money and provide for their families, or to make money and spend it on whatever the hell they want because they're grown men. Why do we watch cage fighting? And why do we watch cage fighting? I would say it's to be entertained by martial arts. So it's their job, essentially, to entertain us so that we purchase tickets and buy pay-per-views to pay them. Now, this whole idea of fighters should be paid more, a lot of fighters only fight once a year. Maybe 3 times a year, maybe once every 18 months. And there seems to be this idea out there that if you're in the UFC, you should be on at least $300,000 to $500,000, whether you win or lose, and that you should have healthcare for life. Also, if you are a champion or fighting for a championship, you should easily be on $4 to $10 million a fight. There are about 300 fighters on the UFC roster. Can you imagine the cost of the payouts for the UFC if they had to pay that much money to every single fighter? Could you imagine how often fighters would actually bother to fight if they were making $400,000 cleared with lifetime health insurance for the entire year? What kind of incentive would they have to actually keep coming back and fight? There was this other discussion about the Francis deal where he was bringing up healthcare for the fighters. And the fighters have healthcare. They all have healthcare underneath the UFC. So there seems to be this want and this need for, if you sign up to the UFC or if you get picked for the UFC, you should have full healthcare for life. Like Parker Porter gets into the UFC and he should have full healthcare for life. Or some kid that grows up on the favelas and God knows what's happened to him up until the UFC should now get full healthcare for life at the end of his 3-fight contract. It's a bit ridiculous. I want to circle back to why I think this discussion of the fighters don't get enough money and they should be paid more healthcare is crippling the UFC, and in the long term is going to bring it down and turn it into just boxing from the 80s and 90s. First thing, which I thought was pretty obvious, is that the UFC is a private company. It's part of Endeavor, which is a publicly traded company. The whole point of the UFC is to generate a profit. And what the UFC has done with that profit and continues to do with that profit is very important to the overall picture here. So far, the UFC has opened up the Performance Institute in Vegas, and fighters can go there and train for free. There are also doctors there. There's also food there. They get all of that for free. So if a fighter is determined on keeping his costs down, he can move to Las Vegas and train at the PI and keep most of his paycheck except for taxes. UFC has also talked about and plan on opening other PIs all over the world so that fighters from multiple continents can go ahead and do that and learn and train at PIs that aren't on the other side of the world. That's all possible because of the profit that the UFC generates. What else does the UFC do with the profit that it gets? Well, it sponsors smaller fight leagues like Eternal in Australia, like Cage Warriors in Europe, LFA, and puts them all on Fight Pass. So it builds a giant platform for young up-and-coming fighters to not only have a linear way into the UFC, but so that hardcore fans can watch all of their fights for $10 a month and provide them with an opportunity to grow on a platform that is established. Along with that, they've also built with the Endeavor deal. Endeavor is now working with the UFC and WWE Slap Championship, and at a press conference not too long ago, Dana White spoke about a deal that he had with the Lorenzo brothers where they were also in charge of other sporting leagues that none of the journalists in the room seemed to know, and I didn't know when I had heard him say that. But what's important to note about that is that the UFC's platform and Endeavor's platform in general is growing. And that means that pretty soon when we get to the end of the ESPN deal, I can very much picture a world where the UFC ditches ESPN or ESPN ditches the UFC, however way you want to phrase it, and we end up with a completely new subscription service, sort of a level above Fight Pass. Maybe Fight Pass will still exist. Maybe it will get rebranded as Endeavor Plus. But there will be a whole new entertainment sporting network that will grow out of this new Endeavor deal. That provides a platform for these fighters that doesn't exist anywhere else. Look at what Conor McGregor has done with Proper 12. Look at what Ronda Rousey did with her career. Look at what Nate Diaz is able to do with his career now that it's outside of the UFC. What Masvidal is able to do with his career now that it's outside of the UFC. He's started multiple fighting organizations. And all of this is because of how big the platform of the UFC is. And that wouldn't exist with this attitude of UFC should give its fighters the profit. What you would end up having is fighters fighting less often and losing their name value. Because the only thing that puts the fighters' names in front of us, the fans, is their activity. But not just their activity in the same place, under the same cameras, week in, week out. That's how they build a connection with the audience. What we've seen under this new narrative of, yeah, go get that bag at another company, stuff the UFC, they don't pay their fighters enough, is that the golden age of the UFC seems to be over. One championship is doing great, the PFL is doing great, LFA is doing great, Cage Warriors is doing great, bare knuckle boxing exists and their last show was awesome. And all the talent in the sports combat world is filtering out through different divisions. And the fans are cheering that on, like fighters are going out and getting their bag. But every single week, what we've seen is that the cards on the UFC weekends at the Apex are getting worse and worse and worse because the talent is becoming less and less distributed, because fighters are getting paid more and more and they're opting to fight less and less. When all the fighters were underneath one banner back in 2010, 2015, it was easy to have these stacked pay-per-views every single month and awesome fight nights every single weekend. But that has been watered down now. And they might get more money in the short term, but the profits will not be shared. Imagine this. It's a Saturday night, there's a UFC pay-per-view on, the prices have already gone up, but because UFC stars and up-and-coming talent have chosen to go to other organizations, next weekend there's a PFL Super Fight pay-per-view. And then the weekend after that, there's a bare knuckle pay-per-view. And then the weekend after that, there's a One Championship Amazon Prime pay-per-view. Now let's be honest, how many people are buying UFC pay-per-views today and how many people are stealing them? How many people are going to be stealing all 4 of those pay-per-views every single weekend in the next 5 years? That means the company's profits are going to drop less and less and less. And the promotions are going to lose their star power, and it's going to become about the star in general fighting other big name stars. But they're not going to be able to grow the talent underneath it, which is exactly what happened to boxing not too long ago. That's why boxing has had a resurgence under celebrity YouTube boxing, because these YouTubers are growing their name outside of boxing and then coming over to boxing to make the money. Whereas right now, fighters are growing their name inside of the UFC. And then once their careers are over, leaving the UFC to make their money. And the UFC keeps saying that the fighters are subcontractors. And they are. And they treat them as such. But that means that you're meant to have a little bit of maturity about how you spend your money and what you choose to do with it. If you were in the UFC, 100 to show and 100 to win, you could pay tickets to fly out to Vegas, do the entire fight camp at the UFC PI, do your fight, collect your winnings, and then the doctors and the medical staff at the UFC are obligated to give you a clean bill of health afterwards. And if you have suffered any damage during that time, the doctors at the UFC are obligated to heal you back up. After that period is done, you have now kept your fight costs down minimally. You've also gotten back to a clean bill of health using the UFC's money, and you now have some of the best healthcare providers in the world saying that you are fully healthy again to go back into your next fight. You could take all that profit and that clean bill of health to a private health insurance company. Now, obviously, your premiums are going to be a little bit higher because you are in combat sports, but you're going into it with a clean bill of health. And if you know anything about health insurance, if you're already healthy when you sign up for that health insurance, your premiums are not that much. They're very affordable. Be an adult. Pay for your own health care. Use one successful fight to pay for your own health care, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. Francis Ngannou was offered $8 million plus pay-per-view shares, and one of the things that he talked about the most was fighter healthcare. How much do you think Francis Ngannou's healthcare would cost as a 36-year-old man for the rest of his life? What kind of premiums do you think the insurance providers would charge for that? Do you think it would be $1 million premium? Probably not. He could easily afford his own lifelong healthcare out of that money. But some people don't want to have to pay for their healthcare. So the UFC say that money is yours. You're a subcontractor. You can spend it however you want. If you want to fly all the way to Thailand to train Muay Thai rather than do it in Vegas, you're free to do that. If you would rather buy cocaine and hookers than your own healthcare after the UFC doctors have just spent all this money bringing you back to 100% health, you can go do that. But then don't go on Instagram and Twitter and bitch that you weren't paid enough. At the end of the day, what we've seen is that as the UFC has grown as a company, it has taken a large amount of profit, invested it back into the company, and throughout the last 30 years of the UFC, fighters' salaries have increased to the point when Ngannou was offered an $8 million deal plus pay-per-view shares. And in 2019, Deontay Wilder was fighting for $10 million. It has become comparable to boxing not too long ago. It wasn't that far off from boxing in 2019. The stronger the UFC has gotten, the better the lifestyle has been for the fighters. The more the fighters have complained because the UFC has gotten so strong, and the more the fans cheer the fighters on to leave the UFC and go to other organizations. But the more that happens, the weaker the UFC will get, and the weaker MMA in general will get as things get watered down. So at the end of the day, the stronger the UFC is, the stronger MMA is. Because without all these names under one house, the profits are going to be spread out. And when the profits are spread out, the attention is going to be spread out as well, because profits are attention. And I have got a feeling that over the next year, while we wait for Francis Ngannou's opponent to appear, I don't think we're going to be tuning in to every single PFL card over the weekends. I don't think we're going to know who the next up-and-comer in the heavyweight division is. And we're going to become casuals. And the fighters are going to suffer for it in the long run. So well done, Francis, and well done everyone that cheered him on out there. Great work.